I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. Vision or delusion? That will be the topic of this little sermon or talk or what have you today. And I want to start with three examples of what I mean. So, years ago, there was a student, a graduate student I was working with, who grew up in the Catholic tradition, came out of that, and started having dreams about Mary. And in these dreams, starting with the very first one, the figure of Mary said to her, I am not the quiet, passive, voiceless person that you were taught that I was. And in the dreams that followed, this figure of Mary was assertive and bold and doing all kinds of strange and outrageous things that were fun and creative. And the student having these dreams, on the one hand, really loved them and enjoyed them and thanked Mary for them and said, This is great. But there was this other part of her that worried that she was just fooling herself or was in a complex or something like that. So, a kind of ecstatic experience mixed with a strong dose of self doubt. Partly because she grew up in a church that has put out the message that only the church can decide which spiritual experiences are actually valid, which is a lot to take on yourself. So that's the first example. The second involves a gay friend of mine who, many years ago, again, he was out walking on a ridge near a mountain, and he had this intuitive, somatic, emotional experience that the mountain was somehow penetrating him. It was a very profound experience for him, and it got him to thinking and then writing about the whole rich dimension of our erotic experience of nature and place and earth. So he came out of that with just treasures to work with for years afterwards. So that's a second example. And the third one has to do with the precognitive dreams that we have. Not sure that's quite the right word. It has a lot of baggage with it, but I think you know what I mean when you dream something and then it happens either right afterwards or a bit later. And it's not only dreams, sometimes it can be very strong fantasies as well. So, an example that's talked a lot about in the Jungian community and that shows up in Jung's Red Book has to do with Jung, 1913, I believe it was. He was on a train ride and he was in kind of this sleepy, hypnagogic state, and all of a sudden, there appeared to him images of first of floodwaters sweeping over most of Europe, not Switzerland. And on the train ride back, same thing, but this time the flood was blood. And at first, Jung, who was a psychiatrist, was afraid that he was being, as he put it, menaced by a psychosis. And then a year later, when the war broke out, he was both horrified and relieved because he immediately realized that the war, as he puts it again, had broken out within him first. So we're going to talk a little bit about what to do with experiences like this and what not to do. And I want to mention too that there is a lot of resistance to recognizing the validity of these kinds of experiences, these visionary encounters, for many reasons. I'll mention a couple of them. One is that a lot of us, including me, grew up in religious settings where we were told that those kinds of experiences were bad and wrong, or even demonic. And I recall being maybe in my early teens, and I was going to confirmation classes in the Lutheran church I grew up in. And I made the mistake of telling the youth counselor about this sense I was having of presences in my room at night. And they didn't feel in any way threatening. It was just like having more people in the room. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. And he got scared and said, no, you need to hold the Bible up like a shield and ward them off, you know. And I never did that. I just thought it was silly. But when I met my birth family, as I'm adopted, met my maternal birth family. Actually, now that I think of it, it's on both sides of my family. But my maternal relatives were asking me about things that happened in my childhood. I was in my 20s at the time, and we were getting to know each other. And I mentioned that, and they laughed. And they said, you know, it runs in the family. We all do that. So for them, it was just like, it happens. People show up, or whatever they are, you know. So if you grew up in a religious tradition where that sort of thing is deeply feared and shunned, then it's going to give you some baggage emotionally, unfortunately. I actually think it's a form of abuse and bullying to do that to people. So that's one thing that stops us from recognizing that these sorts of experiences, not just the ones that I talked about in connection with my childhood, but the other ones that I mentioned from the beginning, they're actually quite common. People don't talk about them much because they're afraid of looking crazy or silly, but they're actually very common. In my years as a psychotherapist, which was some time ago, I heard about these all the time. And then when I became a full-time graduate instructor, the person I mentioned, she was one of maybe 100 people, probably more, who told me about things like this. So it's actually quite common. So shaming on the religious shaming on the one hand tends to make us doubt and discount what's happening to us, and on the other hand, unfortunately, the scientific establishment that thinks that it's so different from organized religion has the same effect by saying you're making it up, you're losing your mind, you have a brain dysfunction, or what have you, right? So this is, of course, the materialist worldview at work, right? The only thing that counts is what we can actually see and maybe measure and all that. So it's a very limiting worldview to live in. And it doesn't realize that it is limited, which makes it even scarier. So part of this on both sides, whether it's the religious shaming part or the scientific worldview part, not scientific, scientistic, that's different. That's an ideology, right? So both of those tend to indulge in something. This is such a useful term. I heard it years ago from my teacher at the time, Lionel Corbett, the Jungian analyst. He talks about the Scrooge defense from the wonderful old Dickens story. And you recall how when the different spirits show up, Scrooge's reaction is fear and rejection. And so oftentimes when our worldview isn't wide enough to include these kinds of spiritual experiences, we fall into a Scrooge defense and we tell ourselves this isn't real, it's explainable by something smaller than what it actually is, and so on. Reductionism is the technical term for this. But the Scrooge defense, because it's a defense, it's designed to protect the ego from what it finds to be intolerable. So unfortunately, the Scrooge defense is very common, and it doesn't always stick to spiritual experiences as its target. Sometimes the Scrooge defense shows up as a form of envy directed at people who enjoy their imagination and their fantasy life and who are hopeful and idealistic. When I was working as a technical writer in the corporate world, I remember telling people, I really want to go to school and become a psychotherapist and study psychology and all that. And there were a couple of people in the office who were probably in their maybe 50s who said, yeah, when we were your age, we had those big dreams too. But after a while, we realized that we just have to settle for what we have and just work, you know. And of course, those were some of the first people to be laid off the year after that when the economy went into a recession and copycat layoffs were happening all over the industry. This was insurance. So they got their professional heads cut off by clinging to their supposedly secure jobs. Same thing is happening today in the tech sector. So part of what I want to spend some time on with all of this is unpacking the difference between a delusion or being delusional, crazy, whatever word you want to use. I'm not being psychiatrically technical. I'm just lumping it all in together. Something delusional happening and authentic vision, authentic spiritual experience. And I'm hoping that hearing this will give you permission to enjoy these experiences because, as I'll say in a few minutes, I think they're gifts of the Spirit, freely given. So, when you're in some sort of a delusion or a complex or what have you, or even psychotic, you lack the capacity for self reflection. So, and believe me, I don't specialize in treatment for psychotic people, but I've been around them, and they don't doubt for a moment where they're coming from. They have no capacity to say, wow, I just had a really powerful visionary, numinous, spiritual, whatever you want to call it, experience. Maybe I'm losing my mind. That never occurs to them. What they'll say instead is, I better go preach the word because everyone needs to convert to my way of seeing things, and I'm going to become the missionary of the world because I have the truth now. That's how they talk, right? There is even I forget the name of the syndrome, Redeemer complex or something like that. There's a name for this in Jerusalem itself because people actually, for whatever reason, sometimes succumb to this and they wind up in psychiatric clinics and hospitals because they think that they're the Redeemer returned to earth and they're going to save all of us and all this, right? That's what a psychosis looks like. There's no self reflection. There is this obsession with I'm right, I'm right, I'm right. By contrast, when you have an authentic spiritual experience, because of everything that I just mentioned, your first reaction will probably be, am I losing my mind? So that's an understandable reaction. It's a very unfortunate one. It's unfair that we should have to even have that. But the fact that you're wondering about it means you're not crazy. So just relax. You're fine. You don't worry about it. You're fine. As long as you can self-reflect, as long as you can sit with the experience, as long as you can tend the idea that, which is what we should talk about next, that this is for you. It's not for the entire world. Then I think you're fine. So that's a point that we should just spend a minute on too. That when we have these gifts of the Spirit, they're for us, and sometimes other people benefit from hearing about them, which is great. And they may even go viral as memes, and that's great too. That's probably all part of the process that's built in. But it's important to recognize that the fact that you have such an experience doesn't mean that you're the next enlightened one. It means that you're an ordinary human being having a wonderful encounter with the transcendent dimension of reality, and that it has something for you that you need to sit with. So in terms of doing that, I have a couple of suggestions, having dealt with this, my own experiences, but also many other people for a long time now. One thing that I would emphasize, especially if you're new to these kinds of encounters or you're not really sure what to do with them, is to find supportive friends, family, colleagues, what have you, who can hear what you're saying, and they may not have had the same experiences, but they know you and they can hear what you're saying and not fall into a Scrooge defense of discounting the experience, because that's the last thing you need more of. So looking for supportive people, and they're out there. You may have to be a little bit brave and say, I'm having these kinds of experiences. Does anyone have any history with this or anything like that? And just know that when people automatically discount them, whether they're on the scientific cynical side or they're on the religious side or wherever it is they're coming from, that's their problem. That's their stuff. It has nothing to do with you, okay? So being able to find supportive people who approach you and say, I'd like to hear more about that. And oftentimes you'll find them in your own family where you least expect it. My parents had very mixed reactions when they heard about this stuff. And now my dad's dead, but my mom's still around and she's more open to it. But I learned from years ago that there's other people I can talk to about it who give me all the support I need if I happen to need it. I don't now much, but so finding that is a good thing. Also, making the time to respect the gift, to respect the experience, and really appreciate it and sit with it and feel into it and let it absorb itself into you and just hear what it has to say. Sometimes the message is fairly simple. The message is just spirit or place or the universe or however you want to think about it, saying, I see you. I see what's happening with you. So sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's a bit more complicated and symbolic and it needs some unpacking. So if you work a lot with dreams, you can do this because you use a lot of symbol work when you work with dreams. But I'll give you one more example, one of my own examples. So some years ago, I was going through a period of multiple losses, which are always hard. And I was deep in mourning. I was out walking in a neighborhood near where I was living and just wanted to be out and distracting myself. And had been sitting a lot with grief. You have to do that with grief. It's got its own timetable. You can't just wish it away or operate on it or whatever. It has to run its own course. So I was letting it do that, but there were times when there was so much of it, I just thought I just need to get up and walk. So I did that. So at one point I was standing under a tree and a breeze came by and it knocked a leaf off of a branch. And the leaf came fluttering down and I put my hand out and it settled in my palm. And the way the leaf turned and was shaped, it happened to look, when I glanced at it, like a teardrop, a green teardrop. And so as I was staring at it, this odd feeling came over me that everything around me, the trees and even stuff like the sidewalks and the field next door to me and all that, the fences, I felt as though, and this was mostly an intuitive or an imaginative feeling, I felt as though everything was aware of the situation I was in, that the place itself was saying, we know you're sad, we know that you're in grief. And I felt very held by that. And so I appreciated that experience and I just stood there with it for a little bit and then I took it home. I've occasionally shared it with people. But sometimes it's as simple as that. And other times it requires some more interpretation. So also it's necessary to give yourself some time to fully integrate the experience into your life. Not just to say, oh, that was a great gift, bye, and I think appreciation also requires making space to let it really sink in. And in the case of the experience I just mentioned, it was one of my clues that there is a consciousness about place that we almost never talk about or write about. So that was an important turning point for me for a lot of reasons. So one other thing too I want to mention about these kinds of experiences is because they are gifts, it's important, I think, not to try to hang on to them or to go actively seeking them. When you think about it, let's say that it's your birthday and people give you presents. It would be discourteous to then call them all up a week later and say, can I have more presents? In the same way, when we get these experiences, and they go by so many names, numinous experiences, peak experiences, things like that. I think it's good courtesy on a spiritual level to be content with what we receive and not actively search for them. That indicates a certain restlessness that perhaps we should look at in ourselves. Are we using these experiences to prove to ourselves that there's a spiritual dimension of reality? Is that why we need more of them? Are we covering up a depression or loneliness or anxiety or what have you? There's usually a reason for it. But in the case of not hanging on to it, there's a story that always comes to my mind from the Brazilian writer Clarice Lispector, and I forget the title of it, but it was a conversation, an imaginal conversation with Saint Teresa. And so at one point during this conversation, uh, Saint Teresa, her version of Saint Teresa, says something like, you can be pruning an orange tree when the door to heaven suddenly opens. But eventually, the door closes again. And when it does, there's still the orange tree to be pruned. So, in terms of receiving these gifts of spiritual experiences, I think it's important to realize that once the glow of the experience is worn off, you need to pay the bills. Or just get about your life in whatever way you were doing it, right? And I'm also reminded, too, of how often the sacred literature of many cultures, teachings all over the world, emphasize the capacity for seeing the sacred in the daily details, in the everyday, which is harder to do. If you're walking down the street and the sky opens up all of a sudden and the voices of the gods talk to you, that can be moving and even terrifying, but it's nothing that you have to make happen. It just falls on you, right? But to cultivate the ability to see the sacred in daily things requires, for most of us, requires more work. And in that sense, it may be that these spiritual gifts are reminders of that. They may be little lessons that say, keep doing that, keep going along the road of the sacred in your daily experience, because you won't always get these big encounters. So it's a useful reminder. May the week bring you blessings.